COVID-19, a virtual panel hosted by the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit in partnership with the Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities Research and Education in the College of Pharmacy at Xavier University of Louisiana. My name is Dr. David Robinson Morris, and I'm the founding director of the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit, and your co-moderator for this afternoon's very important panel discussion. The Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit was founded in August of 2018 as a response to our calling as a Black and Catholic institution of higher learning, and just one way we at Xavier can put our knowledge into practice toward the creation of a more just and humane society. We focus our efforts on crystallizing community research and activism within the areas of educational equity, criminal justice reform, and environmental justice. The center serves as a present point of intersection that brings together 95 years of our history at Xavier, working to combat and dismantle oppressive systems, triumphing in the face of adversity, reclaiming our shared humanity, and educating human beings who go out into the world ready to do justice always and in all ways. This afternoon's panel is another glimpse of what we attempt to do to inform and galvanize while impacting policy, changing practice, and uplifting the human spirit. Here's what we know now more than ever. Racism, environmental racism, is killing people of color in this country and around the globe. The effects of environmental racism have been amplified by COVID-19 and its desperate impact on communities of color. What we seek to do tonight is highlight the issues of environmental injustice for Black and marginalized communities. As I remarked in a recent lecture at Boston College, the EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. They say that this goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental health and health hazards, and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. I have two words for the EPA: Flint, Michigan. Here in South Louisiana and on the Gulf Coast alone, the impact has been devastating. Just to name a few, we've experienced the destruction of Hurricane Katrina, the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, rising sea levels due to climate change, and the Formosa Plastics Group that wants to build another polluting chemical plant in a predominantly Black community in St. James Parish. Now, on top of all of this, we have to contend with the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black families and more Black death. Given the expertise on this panel, I'm certain this is going to be a dynamic and informative conversation. Before turning it over to my co-moderator to introduce each of the panelists, on behalf of the university, let me personally thank each of you for sharing yourselves with us tonight. Much, much gratitude to each of you. Now I want to turn it over to my co-moderator, Tynesia Fields, Community Engagement and Outreach Coordinator in the Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities Research and Education. She will introduce the panelists and tell us a bit about their center. Tynesia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robinson Morris. Yes, so I just want to bring greetings to everyone, and on behalf of the Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities Research and Education here at Xavier within the College of Pharmacy, and under our director, Dr. Daniel Sarpong, I just want to say that we're so glad to be collaborating with the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit on these Truth Exposed virtual panel discussions that have been, I think, so important for us to continue to discuss how COVID-19 has been exacerbating the disparities in our community. And so the Center for Minority Health and Health Disparities, our mission is to mitigate disparities that are impacting the medically underserved and communities of color who are disproportionately affected by these inequities due to systems, as we know, and social determinants that impact our health, like environmental justice, or environmental injustice rather. And so we want to move the needle forward through community partnerships, through research, and through education, and with our Health and Wellness Center, in order to move from injustice and disparity to equity and justice. And so we know that there's much to be done beyond COVID-19, but we're excited for the conversation to be had in the midst of COVID-19 and in the midst of much else that is happening in our country to this right now. And so we just want to say thank you for being here. And we thank the panelists, our expert panelists, who are going to carry this discussion forward. And so speaking of our panelists, I'd like to just share with you who we have here at the table. And so we have Ms. Rashida Ferdinand, who is the founder and executive director of Sankofa Community Development Corporation. We have Lieutenant General Russell Honore, the founder of Green Army. We also have Dr. Adrian Katner, who is the Assistant Professor of Environmental and Occupational Health Sciences at the Louisiana State University and the School of Public Health, excuse me. And finally, we have Dr. Beverly Wright, who is Executive Director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. So again, I echo Dr. Robinson Morris's comments that we thank you so much for being here. You can find their extended bios on the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirits website, as well as the recording of the discussion, which will be on the website as well. So I've just shared, just their title and where they are now. But as you can imagine, these experts have a slew of efforts that they've done and contributions that they've made in this space. So please go check out their bios as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tynesia. A bit of housekeeping. If you have questions for the panelists tonight, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Please be mindful not to use this function as a chat feature. We can see everything you're writing. Panel organizers are working behind the scenes to review questions and provide them to Tynesia as we progress through tonight's panel discussion. Tynesia will pop in when appropriate to ask audience questions to the panelists. All right, now let's begin. We'll start with each of our panelists introducing themselves and situating themselves within the larger conversation of I keep talking about economic justice, right? They're very tied in though, of environmental justice and COVID-19. If we can begin with Dr. Wright, that would be great.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Beverly Wright. I am director of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice here in New Orleans, Louisiana. What you should know about me is that I was born and raised in New Orleans. I'm a product of New Orleans Public Schools, Bellina C. Jones, Rivers Fredericks, McDonough 35. And I got my undergraduate degree at Grambling State University, where I then went on to the State University of New York at Buffalo and received a master's degree and a PhD. What's important for you to also to know is that the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice got its start at Xavier University. It was our first home, where Dr. Norman Francis was the first to invest in the concept of environmental justice and the belief that we needed to fight for justice. And my 2 words to EPA would be what I've said forever, and that's Cancer Alley. Cancer Alley is where we began our work, and one of our biggest clients was St. James Parish fighting for MOSA. Wow. So here we are full circle, and we're back doing the same thing. Something interesting about me is that we are reorganizing the National Black Environmental Justice Network. It is an organization for such a time as these. It is a project of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And I want to say hello to Dr. Sarpong. Again, Dr. Sarpong was our researcher when we did the research down the corridor looking at the spatial distribution of TRI facilities by race and income. He was a young researcher. I was a little older researcher at the time, but his work still lives on, and I'm so happy to hear that he is back. And even more interestingly, one of our latest projects right now is that we are offering community awareness classes for COVID-19. And we have developed and we are now presenting community awareness for workers. I'm losing my thought for a minute, that comes with age, but for efficient, what are they called? Efficient workers. I call them frontline workers. So we have all of these classes. In our first class, we had over 100 people on it. So we know we're doing something that's needed. And so we'll be offering these classes to the city of New Orleans, but of course, across the Gulf Coast region.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Rashida, can you take us?
Yes, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel today. I am from the Lower Ninth Ward area of New Orleans. I was raised in the Lower Ninth area as well as New Orleans East during my teenage years, but my formative years were in that neighborhood with deep relationships with my parents, grandparents, and extended family, educated in that neighborhood, and just learned the importance of community and having that simple appreciation for our natural environment. Part of our games as kids were playing outside in the dirt, counting the blue jays and cardinal birds that we saw, just really playing with the trees. And I hear these stories from my uncles and my father and other people of their generation of actually going into these areas that were wetlands and seeing it as a natural part of their experience as children. And what happened, I would just say the other day, a brief story is we're building a wetland park, we meaning Sankofa CDC. It's an organization that I founded in 2008 with a team of community stakeholders to really emphasize the importance of revitalization with significant resources through health and wellness, a platform of health and wellness, looking at that through that lens of public health, but supporting economic and community growth in our neighborhood. And I brought my thought process and planning process to this work with my background as an artist and thinking about creative thought and hopefulness and critical thinking and building something that may not actually exist, but into something more, and using memory in that approach. And so a lot of our work deals with that. We adopted the name Sankofa it's a concept from Ghana and Sierra Leone in West Africa, which means go back to your past to build for your future. And that's significant for our way of approaching our work, planning and decision making. And so those people that informed me, in addition to family, people who are in my family and community of family members, as well as new friends who actually, because the community of the Ninth Ward is so small, historically, from generations ago, that they have a familiarity with what was there and the people who were a part of it. So it's been a great experience, but we have a lot of work to do. The Lower Ninth Ward, I would say the landscape, what's going on there in the streets, as far as the lack of development, the increase in blight has gotten worse. It has not gotten better. We still do not have commercial development. We don't have those quality of life resources that are very important. We have overgrown blight, trees and weeds and grass that's grown over 10 feet tall, holding people hostage who have built their homes and returned back to their communities. And I was actually at the corner of Florida Avenue and St. Maurice Street, really looking at ways of clearing out that land with our Office of Neighborhood Engagement, seeing ways we can work with the Neighborhood Engagement Office through that Clean Up NOLA project, as well as our goals to continue to expand our wetland park of 40 acres on that linear area of Florida Avenue. And I actually didn't know where I was. And I recall visiting, I'm gonna say it was a visit, I was with my uncle, Kalamu Yasalam, 2008, looking for our grandfather's house. And we found his house to talk about the memory. We were doing some video work around that. And a man actually came up to us and he could not find his house. Our grandfather's house was a solid brick house. This man's house had floated down the street. And what I'm saying now at this time, while I saw my grandfather's house, this day and time in 2015, 2020, I can't find it. I didn't even know where I was till I saw a street sign. And it's unacceptable, it's painful, it's hurtful, and we have to do something about it. And we have large scale dumping. We have chemicals that are in barrels that have been sitting on the streets in this neighborhood for over a year. We've contacted the city about it. We've done our due diligence. We have cement, we have all kind of trash being dumped intentionally, waste, sewage waste being dumped. We witnessed it and videotaped it. And it's unfair, it's unjust. And a part of our approach is really intentionally applying the resources that we can get, but working with our municipal government agencies and partners to make a difference and make this an active part of change in our community.
Oh, Rashida, you brought up so much there. We're going to get into a lot of what you brought up there tonight. Thank you for that. Dr. Katner.
Dr. Katner, you're mute.
Okay. So a little bit about myself. I grew up in Gentilly Woods on the edge of Pontchartrain Park, and I decided to leave home for my education and went to California. And I went there because I wanted to learn more about environmental science from the experts who were really spearheading it at the time. I had always intended to come home, and so I did. After Katrina, I came back and worked in the Office of Public Health for 7 years. And it was during that time that I saw that industry had more influence on, had more political influence in the state than even our own residents. So eventually I left the government. I felt inadequate, in sort of an inability to make any kind of change within the organization. And I came to academia, and that's where I picked up research looking at lead in drinking water in New Orleans. I had noticed that there were some high lead levels in the water after Katrina when people were just returning to their homes. So I started investigating that, and the more I investigated it, the more I realized that there are problems with our drinking water regulations, there are problems with oversight and enforcement of those regulations, and also how utilities collect water for compliance testing. That work raised a lot of attention throughout Louisiana, and I started to collect samples in St. Joseph, Enterprise, and other rural communities, and even well-reliant communities, people who had no water system but were relying on their private wells. Through that work, I saw very big water quality issues throughout the state, and that research gained nationwide awareness. It sort of increased our awareness about how ubiquitous the problem of access to drinking water is in Louisiana. So I've also worked in areas where we have had historical floods. So we know that with climate change, we're going to see more rain, more hurricanes, more flooding. And I've worked to understand how communities that are reliant on their own water supplies, how they react to, respond, and recover from these events. And what I noticed was we are not prepared, despite the preparation we had from Katrina. Our flood insurance maps were inaccurate. There was gaps in well user knowledge on how to treat and test their water. There was also weaknesses in the state surveillance, response, and recovery systems. So, so that is some of the research that we've done, but because of that and through that, I've also been called to work with communities on air quality issues. So I've worked with communities along in the Treme that are impacted by the I-10 to understand what their air quality problems are. And so it relates to the whole COVID issue because, through some preliminary study out of Harvard that found that there are higher rates of deaths of COVID-infected minorities than there are in air polluted areas and there are in cleaner areas. And so what that is obvious because we see in high pollution areas, we see mostly African-American residents, partly due to political, lack of political power, lack of political voice, to stop the pollution. And this impacts the lungs, and COVID impacts the lungs. And there's also a lack of healthcare access. There is a lack of employment because of this, the impact of COVID pandemic on communities. And so it's not unusual. It's not surprising to see a higher death rate among Blacks in high polluted areas. And we definitely see some of the highest death rates of COVID in the industrial corridor area of Louisiana. So I hope we can talk about that today and why that is. Through all of these different studies, what I've observed is that one of the biggest problems is the lack of political power held by residents, held by African-American residents, but also LGBT residents and other residents, and a corruption of our democratic processes. So I hope we can talk about that today.
Yes, thank you. We're going to talk about all of them today. Those are key. If General Honore is here, we'll invite him to introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Russell Honore. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, actually I'm off my office now. I'm off with my horse. It's about to run. So I will be with you for a few minutes and then come back in about 20 minutes.
Okay.
I'm honored to be a leader of the Green Army. We started in 2012 because of pollution related to air, water, and land. We work bills in the legislature. We work with first line units from Camp Minden to Alexandria to Lake Charles to Baton Rouge, Napoleonville and the Salt Domes, and throughout St. James, St. John's Parish and East Baton Rouge Parish. And we work collaboratively with first line organizations, and we help them achieve their objectives of fighting pollution, fighting for clean air, clean water, and clean land. Of the 1,240 water wells in Louisiana, water systems, 400 of them are at risk. I look forward to discussion. Big thing, most of these are poor people, and most of them are African Americans. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you, General Honore. Wow. Water, politics, climate, land, place, right? All of these things matter. And we're going to talk about all of those things today. As we begin, for our viewing audience, let's start with definition of terms, right? So we talk about environmental racism, we talk about environmental justice. What do those terms mean and why are they important? That's for any one of you, not all at once.
Well, this is Beverly Wright. Since I'm probably the oldest person on the panel, I was actually around and was a part of defining environmental justice. I was around with EPA in the very beginning on the first NEJAC that was created to deal with these issues. And a lot of people don't know, but a lot of the progress or lack of progress that people see who weren't here like 30 years ago is because of the work that was done in Louisiana. Louisiana was considered the hardest nut to crack because of our relationship to the petrochemical industry. All of the environmental groups gave up on Louisiana. They said they had come down, they had tried, and we were hopeless. And so when the center started in 1992, we began by working with groups that coined the phrase environmental racism, which was Dr. Benjamin Chavez. He was the first person to use that term. When a reporter was asking him, what do you think is happening? And he said, I think it's an environmental racism. And that happened years ago when I was much younger, during the time when we first started the Center at Xavier in 1992. And so that term, environmental racism, a lot of people don't know, initially was called, we use the term environmental equity. And it changed to environmental justice because community people, most of them in Louisiana, at a meeting, asked us, well look, little girl, that's what they called me. What does that mean, equity, environmental equity? And so we went on to try to explain, and she said, oh, no. We don't want anybody. We don't just want it spread around. We don't want anybody to live with poison. What we want is justice. And that's how the term environmental justice came to the forefront. And most of it happened in Louisiana. All the noise for EJ was in Louisiana, up and down the Mississippi River corridor. And St. James Parish was our biggest fight to stop the Formosa plant from coming there. So when I think of environmental justice, I think of the absence of Cancer Alley. That's that 85-mile stretch of land between New Orleans and Baton Rouge that has 136 plus petrochemical plants and 6 refineries, all of which is still growing. I don't see, and I'd rather talk about it like that, what I don't see is communities with crosses in front of their lawns showing how many people in their homes upriver had died from what they believe is pollution. I don't see all of the small animals dying in areas where community people used to go and kill rabbits with nothing left but crows. I don't see the moss dying on the trees. I don't see screens rusting and falling off the windows about every 6 weeks. This is what Cancer Alley looked like when I was working in that area, and it was releasing 800 million pounds of carcinogens to the land, water, and soil before we began working in '92. We got that number down to about 185 million. It's since gone up to over 200 million pounds, but that still is far too much when you think of Texas that has close to the same numbers, and most of our numbers are coming out of an 85-mile stretch. Just think how big Texas is. So we now have the highest cancer rate in the nation. Of the top 10 cancers, Louisiana is number 1 in 7 of those 10 cancers. But yet we've yet to get a real study of air pollution, except for what Dr. Sarpong and I did years ago, looking at spatial distribution. Where do people live? Who lives closest to this stuff? You know, and even out of LSU, something came looking at plumes to see where the wind blows. You know, my thing is, I don't care where the wind blows. If you're next to it, you're getting it consistently, constantly, as opposed to the wind blowing it in different directions. So a part of our fight has been science for defining environmental justice, environmental racism, with the science not being there, and such a hard pushback on scientists doing what they need to do to help protect us. It's been turned into a political football, as have wearing a mask versus not wearing a mask. It's the same fight over and over again. So environmental justice to me is the absence of, you know, pollution in our communities. It is the absence of disproportionate numbers of diabetes and heart attacks, respiratory ailments, all of which emanate to a great extent from our environment. Now, I don't want to say all, but much of it is exacerbated by where we live.
Wow.
I would like to follow it, acknowledging Dr. Wright as a mentor organization and a leader in our community that's taught us by example how to put vision and activism to action, to actually implement this work and look at the core policies with authenticity and fearlessness to say what the truth is. And following people who've done this work on a policy level as a nonprofit or corporate or whatever type of model they have, but a organized organization, as well as groups of community leaders and stakeholders that are also doing this work, has been informing us as an organization. So we didn't start Sankofa with a model of environmental justice, but it's a natural fit of equity, of anti-racism work, of policy and leadership. and change, actually implementing change. And I actually learned some activism around environmental work just by members of my family. The women in my grandmother's generation came from the city. My grandmother's from the Treme, her cousins from the Treme, my father's mother's from the Lower Ninth Ward, grew up in the Lower Ninth Ward, but they married men who were from rural areas. And the rural is a large fabric of many people who live in New Orleans, but especially in the Lower Ninth Ward. And my mother's family always went to Inglorious House in Convent, Louisiana, in St. James Parish. And that's where they went for family gatherings. Sometimes they would have family gatherings in Lower Nine or LaManche and Johnson, and sometimes they'll go to Convent. Both of my parents are from Lower Nine, so there's St. Maurice and then there's LaManche and Johnson. But the memory that my parents have was safety and health and community and farming. And what happened over that period of time were those plants that Dr. Wright's talking about started to move into these Black neighborhoods, these beautiful neighborhoods where they farmed and built their homes. And my Aunt Gloria spent a large part of her lifetime fighting against that. And that's where I really learned about Cancer Alley. And it's interesting, when I got to know Beverly Wright and started getting involved in this work, I learned also about the larger work that they're doing with groups like Deep South, groups like Justice and Beyond. And it's made me really appreciate that importance of community leadership and actively making a change. And so I'm in this role to continue to learn. This is really new information to me. I'm learning it through memory. I'm learning it through generations who I'm following. And that's what's impressing me about this not being a new movement. This is something that we are carrying on, and we have to continue to learn and listen and take on that mentorship. And we recently were awarded a mini grant from EPA called Environmental Justice. And it resonates to me that it's really important to recognize what Dr. Wright is saying of how this became something that became a part of policy now. So groups can get some resources to be active around that, but we need to still apply the work that we're doing to make our leadership, our politicians or people who are supposed to enforce the policy accountable. Following what Dr. Adrian said, we feel helpless many times when we try to do our due diligence, we try to do what we've been told we're supposed to do, report this information, follow up on it. We have paper trails, we have emails, we have evidence. The barrels are still sitting there. And we can't even bring children to enjoy this wetland park because it's a biohazard. And it's really sad, and it's scary, and we need help with having those tools to advocate for what we need to have a right to a healthy quality of life in the neighborhood that we chose to live in.
Thank you, Rashida. So this leads me to hearing all of this, right? And I understand that for people of African ancestry in the African diaspora, right, the environment, the nature is a real living thing. It's part of who we are. There's a beautiful saying that that goes somewhat like the ancestors say, when you cannot figure things out, get your hands in the soil. They're the antenna to your soul, right? Get your hands working in the dirt. But it also strikes me after listening to all of you, we know that there's an issue, right? We know that these things are problems. What's stopping us? Do the leaders just not give a damn, or do we not have the resources? But we know that these are real things that are affecting human beings. It's a moral issue at some point, right? You know that this is going to cause harm, right? Let's talk about the issues that are stopping us from realizing environmental justice, that are stopping us from realizing the eradication of Cancer Alley, right? And I know money is one of them, but I'm also looking at our politicians. Can y'all talk a little bit about that?
I can speak from a science perspective. It's very hard to associate sometimes environmental diseases, environmentally associated diseases with pollution. And because of that, there's a lot of discrepancy in the scientific literature. And so depending on what your position is, you can point to that study or this study to support what you're trying to do. And so that has hampered providing the evidence for what's occurring. Now, most people don't need the amount of evidence that's being called for. I mean, you can look out your door in these neighborhoods and see what's happening. It's evident. But I think science can be used against these communities just as much as it can be used for them.
Yeah.
So this is Dr. Wright again. To a great extent, it goes back to what I would call systemic racism. Because I have seen with very little evidence for wealthy white people, their communities bought out and cleaned up. Whereas in the case of Mossville, Louisiana, or we can go to the Agriculture Street landfill community right here. And that was one of our first cases where we fought very hard to get that community bought out, and it never happened. What they gave us was a cheap cleanup, one that wasn't very healthy at all. And the only thing that moved Ag Street out was Katrina. And what's left there are the people who are unable to move. So science certainly can be used, and you can find Dow Chemical will back a study and to point out what they want to say, why their why their plant is not unsafe. And then you can have EPA scientists say, oh, but it is safe. But in the end, the politicians make the decisions. And what are those decisions based on? Well, for white people, pretty clearly is based on the fact that they see white communities as valuable, but they don't see ours as valuable. And that's why in Cancer Alley, we were able to show that the people who live closest to polluting facilities were African American. They live within 3 miles of a polluting facility, and not just one, but clusters of facilities. And the results were different from white people, even in a place like St. James Parish or Convent. What happened was the bosses of the plants came down and bought the white citizens out and left the Black community's fence line to these facilities. Now that is not science, political science, but certain it is, but it's not science. I've watched in Europe when there was a thought that apples had something on it that was hurting kids. They didn't need science. They immediately took the apples out. You know, by chance, just in case it was hurting their children, they removed it. It has to do with the values that we have in this society and the fact that African Americans are the only people who were legally enslaved by this country. The Confederacy is the only group that lost the war and then were able to rebuild everything just the way they wanted, even statues to treasonous generals. This is where we live, and this is why 400 years later, this is where we are. This is why Black people are sicker, because of where we live. Food deserts, you name it, everything negative, we end up with it. And we're looking right now at the gains that we made in 1978. We have not moved past that. The income, wealth for white people is $117,000 on average. For Black people, it is $17,000. I am speechless when we begin to talk about the differences in all the work we have done. You look at our schools, HBCUs. Look at the way grants are given and the percentage of the money that goes to Black schools versus white schools. It will blow your mind. Look at health disparities centers. All the health disparities are mostly in the South, but all of the centers are elsewhere. And I've sat on these committees. When you see who make the makeup of the committee and the fights I've had within those committees, they are people who don't look like us, and they certainly don't represent our schools. They represent Harvard, Princeton, Yale. And when they get on those committees, they fight for their schools, for the money to go in those same places. So something has to happen to break this up. And so far, nothing that we've done has. And so I'm an old radical. We need reparations. We will never, ever get out of where we are until something major is done to bring us up so that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We have no boot, and we certainly don't have a strap. But in spite of that, some of us still make it. I did. But if I go back to my community, I'm one of a few who did. Is it because I think I'm special? No. I just got a few breaks. I just got a few breaks that my other friends did not, who were just as smart as I was, who didn't make it. We need reparations. And how that reparations is to come to us needs to be studied. I just want my check right now. I think every Black person deserves a check, and then you can deal with the structural stuff. But that is what we need. We can keep talking. We have been here before. I have been here before, several times before, and we are in the same place. They are still killing Black men and women. The only difference is it's on camera. They have been killing us. It's just on camera. Yeah. So things have not changed a whole lot. You know, our children are in poverty at numbers that are disgraceful for a country that is this rich. You know, the blaming us for what they've created is what I can no longer tolerate. And so I've watched science be used in all kinds of ways. I sat on every kind of committee you can imagine. I watch all NSF, all of them. Dr. Wright, we need you. Where they've been trying to get a really great proposal through in a minority institution, but the white people won't let it through. They come out with all kinds of excuses because they don't understand our plight or our work. I hate to be pessimistic, and I am truly an optimist. I'm excited about young people and where they are, and I am so glad that they don't have the patience that we have had. That's all I can say, that they will be out there until there is change. That's where I am. Yeah. And if I offended anybody, I'm sorry, but right now I'm in no mood to apologize for anything.
I'm with you, Dr. Wright. I'm with you. You bring up a good point. Go ahead, Dr. Cadman.
I have to say I feel also, you know, a lack of hope sometimes that I can do anything because, you know, the limits of science and the powerlessness of these communities. You know, they have been removed from the political process or political, and we're seeing it now. You know, what's going to happen in November? You know, are we going to be able to vote? I think we're in a very dangerous place in this country right now with regards to the current administration. And I am also really happy that we have young people on the streets today protesting every day, every night, because that's what it's going to take. And I am also, you know, struggling.
Yeah, it's
someone asks, oh, go ahead, Dr. Rhodes.
No, go ahead, Tynesia.
Yeah, I think I wanted to mention this question, and we have a few in the queue, but we have Pamela Jenkins who asks, what do you all think about this relationship between COVID and environmental justice? You know, you can focus on Cancer Alley, but I think in general as well, what is the relationship between COVID and environmental justice? And you all have touched on this, and I'll tack on another Pamela's question, Pamela Waldron Moore, who says, are the determinants of environmental injustice mostly racial, or is it also a matter of poverty? Poor neighborhoods are more likely to live closer to pollutants and factories. So you may have touched on a little bit of this, but if you can respond to those, I think they'll appreciate it.
You're on mute, Dr. Wright. You're on mute.
I just wanted to say that the issue of the relationship between race and poverty is really not a real question. because our race has determined poverty for us. You can almost not separate the two, but even when you do it scientifically, when we look at different variables, race trumps class for us. In other words, even if you are a relative, let's say high school graduates, for example, Black high school graduates live in areas more polluted than white dropouts. So if you're a white person who's a dropout, a high school dropout, where you live is still much cleaner than where a person with a high school graduate. So we've looked at this over and over again because it's always brought up. Isn't it just class? Isn't it class? It's not really race, it's just class. No, it's race. And it's been shown over and over again. And you can ask any Denzel, Oprah, almost any wealthy Black person about how they're treated, and they will tell you they are Black first, and that's how they're treated. You know, I don't want to talk too much, so I'm just going to stop there and let someone else speak. It's a bad trait for college professors. We talk too much, and I do want to share the.
You're right. So one of our, to your point, Tynesia, and to the point of the audience member who asked the question. So I presented this question to the panelists, right, about COVID-19 and environmental justice. And on May 7th, Catherine Bagley, who's a writer for Yale, so we were just talking about Dr. Wright, for Yale Environment 360, published by the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, penned an article titled "Connecting the Dots Between Environmental Justice and the Coronavirus." And in the article, she writes, I quote, "While cities and towns across the United States are wrestling with the devastating impacts of coronavirus pandemic, none have been hit harder than low-income and minority communities. Places like Detroit, Chicago, and she names St. James Parish in Louisiana, are plagued by decades of economic inequality and pollution in impoverished neighborhoods. They've experienced some of the country's highest mortality rates from the virus. Recent studies have shown a link between higher levels of pollution and an increased risk of death from COVID-19, right? And so the panel is framed in a way where we can get to and talk about why this global pandemic has to also be seen through the lens of environmental justice. Can we speak to that?
I want to say that what has happened with our experience in working in this time period since March, when things shifted, was that the need didn't change beyond the safety for COVID, which is extremely important. We're operating a food pantry, we're implementing various safety procedures, social distancing, wearing our masks and screen guards. We're doing those sneeze guards and implementing those policies to still provide fresh food and healthy food for people. So we're doing it 5 days a week, and it's important. But the other needs that we've been addressing with our work has not changed. And what happens is the grass that was 6 feet becomes 10 feet. The pollutant barrels are still there. More people are dumping now because maybe the city has stopped working on these other areas because there's been a transition into focusing on, disaster recovery work from COVID. And, I've met with our partners who we've asked to help us with this, and the budget's limited, time is limited. Things are just moving very slowly. And so it's easy to just get forgotten, and this is not an issue, and this is not important, because we want to compartmentalize what health equity means. And health equity is not just food distribution. It's not just connecting with the pantries and those things. It's jobs, it's housing, it's our environment, it's what we breathe, it's our healthcare. It's so many different things that we still need to bring our attention to. So we're being present to that, but it is a challenge. And I just want to say what our ask is for our politicians, if they're in the city representatives, if they're part of this call, is to please have an intelligent, real, authentic conversation with us that includes planning and resources. We can acquire resources. I don't want to hear that we don't have money anymore. I don't want to hear it again. We can get the money. There's enough money floating around in this country to do the work that we need to do. I want a serious plan to do something about the situation in which people are living and held hostage and children are growing up in our city. It's not right. And it's beyond that. It's racist, it's evil, and I'm going to say that word because it is, and it's traumatic. And I'm really tired of not getting a response. I'm tired of having token representatives who our city government folks go to as the spokespeople for what we need in our community, and not equitably talking to everyone who has some capacity and who's been doing this work to get stuff done. This is not a game. This is people's lives that we're dealing with. And we have pictures, we have people on the ground who I've been working with for many years, including, we'll say, Vanessa Garringer's taken pictures and shown it. We don't do anything about it. It's been on Facebook. It's been shown around the city, the world, on social media. We've talked to them about it. I visited Philadelphia, I visited Milwaukee. I have yet to go to Detroit, but I've spoken to people who are doing work in Detroit. There are plans out there. There's best practices out here. And I'm tired of hearing that this doesn't fit in our legal system, or we have to look at policy, or we have to talk to state. And I'm just tired of hearing all these excuses and not really sitting down and making a plan to make it happen, because it is possible. I know it's possible because I've seen it done. So that's what I asked for. I would like to meet, and not just meet and talk and walk away and have me follow up and be that Rashida again, emailing you. I want us to really create a serious plan to clean up this mess and bring a healthy, resourceful quality of life to people who live in our neighborhoods, who are held hostage by the conditions that they're forced to live in.
So I would just like to say there are two things. First, generally, talking about the relationship between COVID-19 and environmental justice. The COVID-19 struggle and environmental justice are one and the same. It represents everything that we have been working for and working against. All of the things in our environment that have in fact made us more susceptible to COVID-19 basically comes from our exposure and the quality of life that we have due to systemic racism. So COVID-19 actually hitches a ride with PM 2.5. So you understand? So if you live in a toxic environment like St. James Parish, or like all of us generally, 71% of African Americans live in a polluted environment. Just think of that in the whole country. 71% of us live in these places. And if you have air pollution, we know PM 2.5 air pollution, COVID-19, they found traces of it on PM 2.5. PM 2.5 goes into our lungs, deep into our lungs. So it's hitching a ride on it. And so we're sicker than other people who are not exposed to PM 2.5. And then, so that takes us in, and we have diabetes and all of these other things that make us weaker to fight it off. And we know where all of this comes from, right? So, but let's just take it home. There are two things of concern to me. New Orleans East, where I live, which is also the 9th Ward, a lot of people forget that, we're in the 9th Ward, is a hotspot for COVID-19. We've been talking about it. Are there any specific plans for New Orleans East to deal with the degree of COVID-19 persons infected with the virus in the East? Nothing. Have we heard anything from people who represent us? Oh, the numbers look pretty good. Yeah, but within that, we have an epidemic in the East. And who's in the East? Black people are in the East. A lot of people who got pushed out of the housing projects are in the East. They are also essential workers. That means they are the people who have to go to work. If they're called back to work, they have to go. If they don't go, they can't get unemployment. So they're almost forced into high-risk jobs. Where the majority of them live? New Orleans East. Not one word from any politician. Let's talk about workers. We're talking about green infrastructure workers, people going back to work. I've actually had conversations with the city about presenting community worker training for people to protect themselves from COVID while at work. There are all kinds of trainings out there, different cities putting things in place. I get a letter back or someone saying, well, Dr. Wright, we think we'll just introduce you to the contractors. And then you can talk with the contractors about doing this work. Is there any contractor who's really gonna say, oh yeah, well, I'll let you take 45 minutes off so you can learn how to protect yourself working next to a person who might have COVID, how to deal with your equipment and all of these other things, how to deal with your tools, how to make sure you protect yourself, not silence. Really nice, sweet, but silence. Nothing has come back. That's why we do our work without the city, without other people. We're doing it anyway. And let's talk about Entergy. Entergy Corporation, they want to start up that plant. What comes out of that plant? PM 2.5, air pollution. Right in the middle of the area of the city that is a hot spot. We're going to start up an electric plant that, guess what? Won't be turned on because we need it. It will be turned on to sell it in the market. And guess what? Right now, the market is what? Flooded. You don't even have a need for electricity like we used to. But guess what, New Orleans? We will be paying for that polluting electric plant that they put in New Orleans. And this is with Black mayors, Black city councils, Black everything, Black people heading up Entergy. We're still getting what we would have gotten under Jim Crow. It hasn't changed. My word to people is vote. Whatever you do, you think that it doesn't matter, it does. We need to get behind people who will really represent us. Put your dollar in the hat to back somebody who will represent you and protect you. Voting is our way out of this.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Wright.
Thank you.
There was a study that came out of Harvard in April that demonstrated, and I'm looking at you, Dr. Katner, that demonstrated the impact of higher levels of air pollution and the rise in COVID-19 death rates, right? Particularly, they did a nationwide cross-sectional study and utilized county level data, which we know is incomplete, largely incomplete, and linked high levels of air pollution with an 8% increase in COVID deaths. 8%. And we know that county level data is not even adequate, right? Why are we not outraged about this, right? This is what I can't wrap my head around, right? People are dying and we're not outraged.
It's who's dying?
There is, so that study hasn't been peer reviewed yet, and that's part of the criticism against it. It's not unusual, and it's certainly anticipated, because what we do know, we've seen this before with respiratory diseases, where people who live in high air pollution areas are more likely to die. So it's not surprising that we see this right now. They're both affecting the lungs. And so you have a weakened population who are under these high air pollution conditions throughout their lives. Whose lungs and heart systems are weakened. And then when they get infected, of course, they're going to die. So we've seen this, this weakening of scientists. We've seen it of all groups in this administration. Scientists don't run science boards at EPA anymore. It's industry. And so that's part of it. Is that scientists can speak, but unless people give weight to what they're saying, unless people trust what they're saying, and there's been a lot of effort to make scientists, to make the press, to make others look like they're fabricating, like they're lying. And that's an unfortunate situation. It's a very scary situation. It harkens back to a period that was much darker than here in World War II. I hope we don't go that way, but like Dr. Wright says, it's about political power now. And I I have to say, everyone's pissed off. Everyone's annoyed. Everyone is just to the breaking point now. People are losing their jobs. They don't have money. They can't put food on their table. My brother sent me a quote that I thought speaks volumes and was from John F. Kennedy. He said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. So I'd like our politicians to think upon that, to think about their bubble, how they live, and think about the rest of us and how we're living and the conditions under which we live. This bubble is going to pop.
It's popping, yes.
Popping.
We're seeing it.
Dr. Wright you mentioned voting and that being a way for people to take action. And so someone asked, our own Dr. Daphne Ferdinand asked, what are some other ways, what are some other things that community members and communities can do to support organizations who are working to ensure we're living in a healthy environment? And how can we communicate this issue effectively to inspire and motivate our community members to become advocates in their living spaces? And I'll tack on one other question that said, what are ways that we can convince people who don't believe and refuse to believe that environmental racism is what it is, environmental racism. So what can communities do to support organizations working in this space? And how can we communicate both to motivate community members to become advocates, but also to folks who refuse to believe that environmental racism exists? How can we communicate this issue effectively?
Was that question to me or in general? To everyone?
To everyone, but
to everyone.
To everyone, but please start us off if you'd like.
Oh no, I'm gonna let someone else talk. I dominate, I know. I'm stepping back. I'll let someone else talk and then I'll talk.
Where's General Honore?
The Green Army would be really good.
Yeah.
So, well, if nobody else is gonna talk, I would like to say this. In my years of working, that was one of the things that I was trying to figure out, because environmental pollution is often not something you can see, although I would say in Cantor Alley, you can see it with all the plumes and you can feel it, you can taste it. But for the most part, PM 2.5, you can't see that. And it's hard for people to believe that they're being hurt by something they can't see. So I developed a model called Communiversity, where we work with universities and communities, and it begins with education and training and finding a way to connect with communities. And usually you connect with communities when there's a problem that they have and you can speak to it. So once you can get in and speak to whatever problem it is that they're having, it opens the door for you to begin an education process. You know, identifying the people who are listened to in the community, starting with them first, is the way that you make headway. So right now at the Deep South Center, we have a Kellogg grant. We're working in 5 states with EJ communities in all 5 states. And in over a 3-year period, we now have a minister who worked in the community, who's now heading up an environmental justice committee in Pensacola. It came with data that they brought. They were able to stop a highway because we were showing how water would flow. You know, when they put that highway in, and that water would flow straight into a very wealthy white neighborhood. And guess what? They stopped the highway, and the $15 million is now going to be placed with communities who want relocation, and many of them do because they live with landfills. So I'm just saying, I'm watching small projects beginning to educate the community. At our first meeting, we had over 100 people who showed up to identify their problems. A lot of times people think it's difficult to engage communities. It's not, especially when they're hurting, but it is how you approach communities. And we need more universities, you know, taking on that approach to working with communities, which is what the Deep South Center does. And we're beating back the bad reputation that universities have because the people working in communities are trying to get tenure. They're not at all interested. That's been the experience of communities. So they don't want to see you coming or going. So a different approach has to be there. And over 30 years, we've developed a great relationship, but guess what? We're just one little center. We can't reach everybody, you know, so we're trying to pass the framework along for other people, you know, to use. It does work. You would be surprised. New Orleans has been the hardest place for me to work, to get communities involved. The hardest, all upriver, so much easier. But with my own neighbors, the people I know, it's been a harder process to galvanize them around environmental issues. With COVID-19, that's a door that has opened up, and we are at the beginning of a pandemic era. And I'm saying that I am certain COVID-19 is not the last of COVID or something else. We're moving into a pandemic era, and the scientists are continually warning us about that. So we really need to find ways to talk with our community and help them to help themselves. Leave something in the community for them to keep and continue to work on, not just drop in, leave something and then leave. You have to train communities to work for themselves. Citizen science is unbelievable. We've been working with citizens, teaching communities how to monitor air, how to test water. We do all of that. And it's been amazing how that has impacted the political structure when they go in with data. So, you know, the work continues. We're in 5 states, of course, including New Orleans, with calls every day from other places. We're just one little center trying to get more people to buy into the idea of working with communities.
We need people like Dr. Wright to train us, to continue to train the next generation. I'm really afraid of what's going to happen when Dr. Wright's, you know, the wellness supers of the state are gone. We have a lot to learn from you guys, and I hope that you hand that information over to us, because we need it.
I echo that. Dr. Wright is one of the giants whose shoulders we stand on in doing this work in the Gulf South, right? And, you know, there's a lot that you know that isn't written anywhere, that only you know. And there's a lot that you do know that is written places, but we need to know what you don't know so we can continue this work, right? We desperately need to continue it. Before we move into sort of our closing comments from the panelists, my final question to you is a question from one of the audience members, and that is, do you think environmental justice is a realistic possibility in this country?
I would respond to say absolutely. I think, you know, before we began this panel, that former police officer, I think, who murdered that man in Atlanta is now being indicted, federal murder charges. I mean, I remember when Trayvon Martin was killed, I was in my office and I saw it. And it was like, whoa. And we become, I'm not going to say it's normalized, but it's not expected that they would be held accountable. And this is twice we're seeing police officers who murder Black men, the boldness and audacity to do it on tape, on film, and they are being charged. Let's see what happens after that. But my point in that is, that's a part of policy. We have attorney generals or people who are in positions of power who can bring these charges forth. And we also have another level of awareness for people across all types of backgrounds and demographics. A lot of young people, they come from Caucasian backgrounds and other racial backgrounds as well, and they want to see things happen. And so it's a different cultural experience that people have and want to see a change. And it's also unbelievable to them. They weren't aware of it. They didn't know. I guess they didn't. The videotape is now data. So my perspective on this is community academic partnerships. That model has been very supportive. It's been a progressive way for us to work to get the data. The devil is in the data. For us to believe it, for us to share it with people and say, this is what happens in your community. This is what happens in communities that don't look like yours. And what you gonna do about it? How do we do something to make this change happen? And there are different ways of doing data and sharing data, whether it's graphs, charts, pictures, testimonials, those kinds of things. But I do believe that we need to convince or vote in politicians who respect data and understand that that also applies to their our economic development and our economic base. So I believe it's possible, but I think there's a lot more education that's needed around this issue. And I'm standing for that, saying that we need to be aware of what we don't know. This is new information for many people. We can have experts in certain areas, but it's important to translate it into lay language so we can respect what is important and also connect with the wisdom bearers, the elders, the people who have had the experience, who know what it's supposed to be like. And that is data as well. And that's very primary. That's very important, that people's lives are a part of the information that we need to capture and their experiences, because it says what this place is supposed to be like, not what it is now.
Thank you. This is Beverly again. I think that it's absolutely possible. I would say 10 years ago, I didn't believe that, but I believe it now, and it's because of climate change. I watched, the big green organizations who would fight us at every turn now knocking on our doors because they realize that they can't get any bill through without us. And as we threatened them and told them over and over again, any bill that you try to get passed that excludes us, or you're sacrificing us for the greater good, we're going to fight against it. So any room they were in, we were throwing bricks at the window, if you know. Now all of a sudden the doors are wide open. We're actually meeting with the green groups. They're actually helping us to raise money. We have an equitable and just climate platform that they have signed on to. And it's basically because things are critical and they realize that. And they realize we all are gonna sink or float together. Mm-hmm. And that's been 30 years we've been fighting the green groups. They're raising money for us now. We're working together on things. That's why I believe that it's possible. Dirty water doesn't stop in Flint, Michigan. Mm-hmm. All the waters are connected. The wind doesn't just stop in Louisiana, and these horrible hurricanes and tornadoes are hitting everybody. The fires are affecting everyone. So you can continue to try to let us just take the brunt of everything that's bad, but it's catching up with them, and they're now reaching out because they recognize that they need us in order for them to survive as well. That's why I'm hoping.
Thank you, Dr. Wright.
Just like hopeful, I think we need power. And I think there's power in numbers. I think all of the groups need to leverage each other. Environmentalists, the workers, LGBT, blacks, women, all of us need to work together and strategize, come up with a plan. Because the big thing that's missing here is power. You're seeing it at work now, and that's what gives me hope. Is every night we have news about what's going on in the streets. And so yeah, I think it's possible.
Thank you. As we close tonight's panel, I would ask each of you to give me and the audience one call to action. What is one thing that we can do to realize environmental justice in the communities that we live in? Tell us what to do. We're asking you to tell us what to do. One thing.
Well, I've already said vote. That's number one. We need to vote like we've never voted before, even more than what we did for Obama. Yeah. And we loved Obama and we went out and voted. We need to vote even more so than that. I think that our lives are literally in danger with this administration. I mean, it's just so obvious, and they're open with it. They're not even trying to hide it. You don't have to guess whether or not these people care about us. We know they don't. I don't think they care about anybody really, except maybe very wealthy people. But other than that, we really need to vote. And we need to start working at our local levels. I mean, it's hard to figure out how to get a really deep conversation going, as Rashida said. And Rashida, we can talk and see how maybe we can bring some of this to bear, where we really have our politicians actually talking to us about what they can do locally. You know, the state we're in, I do understand how difficult it is statewide, but locally we should be able to do more. I don't understand why we don't have more attention to New Orleans East and the lower Ninth Ward, which is all the Ninth Ward. I'm always puzzled by that, you know, when you look at the financial contribution of New Orleans East, and even with Black people sitting up there, we still get everything bad, you know, and an excuse while we see other communities thrive. So when I say vote, we got to vote at every level. And it don't matter to me what color you are, it's what you have in your heart and your head for protecting our community.
Thank you, Dr. Wright.
I also think education is so important. Both of my grandmothers were school teachers, and I put school teaching, education, nursing, you know, medical, health professional, all those social working. I mean, those social workers, those are honorable, you know, critical professions. All of what we do is critical. Everybody on this panel and world, right? But I have a certain respect for those professions. We need to teach. We need to provide information and education resources to children so that the normalcy baseline is tipped a little bit, changed. And that's why I think connecting this intergenerational approach of memory, this is a normal part of communities all over the world where they understand where they come from. They know their history, their lineage, and there's different ways of approaching that, but it's just listening to the stories of what this neighborhood used to be, what inspired people to be here. Where did so many people who came from Ninth Ward area migrate to in other parts of the city or build their lives in other parts of the city? How did they contribute to the city? Because there's a long list that people don't even aware of. And I'm not just talking about Lower Nine, but I'm just saying places where Black people invested and developed communities in space together. But that's what I would say is that we, you know, when children, we look at this concept of George Washington Carver's work, he did these nature gardens, he did so much more, right? But we look at his love and affinity for humanity, for nature, for botany, for ecology, for art, creativity, and education. And, you know, you're looking at what it means to work in a garden, to appreciate the microbes and the earthworms and the beneficial bugs and predator bugs and how plants grow from seeds, to see all those different things that show the miraculousness of life. We need that to be something that is connected to children so that they don't see nature as something to run away from. You know, they see it as something that they're a part of, and they become invested in being active proponents and advocates for a healthy environment. They know what to expect and what their rights are in having a healthy environment. That's a part of what God has created for us to have.
Thank you, Rashida.
Can you share quickly, I know we're closing, but someone asked earlier if there are programs or anything you would recommend for just what you were talking about, Rashida, in terms of mentoring those young people and scholars who are interested in moving into this pathway, interested in working in environmental health and STEM. And so are there ways that you would suggest, are there programs specifically, but also just methods and ways that you would suggest we encourage young people to pursue this work professionally and nationally?
There are a number of programs around the city that do that work. There's that STEM work with Calvin Mackey. There's the work with Dr. Wright's talking about with these, working with students in HBCUs and community academic partnerships. And when you work with in that model and you're working with universities, you're working with the students who they mentor as well. And I'm sure those students are working in community settings. So there's different ways of doing it. You can directly work with organizations that are also supporting young people, having voice and critically thinking about their role and place and environment. I know Grid at Youth Forum is one of those, Liberty's Kitchen. Those are both Black-led organizations, Dennis Begnaris and Devin Turner, respectively, or not respectively, they're leading those organizations. We're doing work around nature play. It's a program that looks at children and connecting them to nature. The normal things that we always did in experience, which has become a little abnormal for kids nowadays. So working with schools to bring that forth to them. I think we can talk offline about that, but we could talk with Dr. Wright or talk to me or any other panelists. There are a lot of different programs out there, but some things we have to build on our own. So I would also ask the person if they're interested to share what their interest is and what they would like to contribute to building something or being a part of something. Because the information is out there, the capacity, the work that goes into the preparation and the operations of it is what is challenging as well. That takes resources and time.
Yeah, I agree with everything Rashida says. I'm not going to repeat it, but I just would like to ask people to go to our website, www.dscej.org. We are doing a number of coronavirus community awareness classes for essential workers. Those are the ones that are coming up pretty soon, in construction and all of these other things, because if you're not going to get it at your own job, then you can get it for yourself. And we're offering these classes. They're becoming very popular. So we'd ask you to go on and sign up for whatever one you'd like. We have one coming up for faith-based, for the faith-based community, since churches are reopening. Black people love going to church, but that is a particular place for spreading the virus. And,
Yes.
and I'm hoping that when that particular course comes online, that we have a lot of people taking that particular class. Be safe. We want you to be safe. Some people don't care if you're not safe. They're hoping that you're not and that you die because they know you're not voting for them. If you know what I mean. So please be safe. Go to our website, see if there's something there you're interested in to protect yourself from this horrible virus.
Thank you. Dr. Katner, you have the final word.
I heard my speaker isn't working.
Oh, it's much better
It's
now.
better now. It's better now. Yeah, it's better.
I think, there's power in numbers, and I think it's time to sort of get rid of those, those past walls between our organizations, whether it's political or religious or LGBT or anything, workers, Blacks, all of us. I think we need to organize together and to change this, because I think there's a lot of people that are being affected by this administration. And we need to stand up for our rights because we're losing them.
Thank you, Dr. Katner. As we close tonight, I want to thank each of the panelists for their time and for providing us with an informative and energetic and engaging conversation. And I want to, on behalf of General Honoré, who's been texting me, he couldn't get back into the Zoom call. So he sends his apologies and he has promised a follow-up conversation. So be on the lookout for that. But thank you on behalf of the center and the university. Thank you, Dr. Wright. Thank you, Dr. Katner. Thank you, Rashida. And thank you, General Honoré, for educating us on what is really at stake here, right? This is the one issue that affects all of us, which is what you said tonight. And you have encouraged us to vote, to organize, and to educate around this issue for real change. And so I thank you for that. Allow me to thank my co-moderator, Ms. Tynesia Fields, and behind the scenes is Karen Blair, program coordinator for the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit, and Yamlak, who is Xavier's IT guru. We thank them for all of their hard work behind the scenes and in bringing tonight's panel to fruition. I hope that you'll join us on Friday for our Juneteenth virtual lunch conversation on the state of race and human relations in this country, and in particular in the city. We have a lot to talk about. I don't know if we'll accomplish it in 2 hours. There is a lot to discuss, but we'll do what we can. More information about that event can be found at our center website. And I'll remind you to please stay tuned after this broadcast ends for a short survey. I hope that each of you are well. I pray that you'll be still. I pray that you'll trust in the infinite and remember our shared humanity. I hope that you'll be community and that you'll always be of good courage. Good night to each of you. Be safe. Thank you.
Good night and thank you.